In Baltimore, I did in Miami, and Luke sort of shadowed Jonathan Scope around for 48 hours, and then the team took a couple of days off and got together again on Friday. And, well, quite frankly, Luke, I think we're still waiting for the Orioles to show up here in the second half of the season. I'll let you lament it. I mean, we were both on Twitter on Saturday, on Sunday, clearly on Friday. The thing got off to a bad start, but it never really did pick up. This will be sort of an infamous weekend if this thing never turns around, right? Like, if this thing goes into the black hole, we will remember the weekend the Chicago Cubs came to Baltimore and kicked the snot out of the Orioles.
Yeah, I think this weekend, and specifically Friday night, with falling behind 8-0, the fact that the lineup showed a whole lot of fight to bounce back from 8-0 and tie it up 8-8 in the bottom of the eighth.
Many turned it off, by the way. You know that, though, already, right, on Friday night.
Yeah, but I think that sure felt like the final nail in the coffin. And let's face it, I mean, this team struggled for 2 months now. You know, it's go back to the beginning of last July, this team 7 games under 500 over, I think, 175 games. They haven't played particularly good baseball for the last calendar year. It's just last year they built such a cushion for themselves in the first half that they were able to still make the playoffs. So you go back, you look at that, you look at how from the middle of May on played out. You get to the All-Star break. I think the most optimistic fans try to talk themselves into some hope. They win the final 2 games of the Minnesota series. You have 4 days to just sit there and you imagine scenarios, and you think, well, if Chris Davis is coming back, Zach Britton came back right before the break, maybe, just maybe, homestand. They've played well at Camden Yards this year for the most part until of late where that hasn't been the case. And then this weekend against the Chicago Cubs is just a bucket of freezing ice water to any semblance of hope, any ounce of optimism that things are going to turn around. And I think you kind of just face reality and say, it's not going to happen. This team's just, they're not going anywhere. I mean, the worst run differential in the American League. They have the worst starting pitching in the American League. Starter ERA, a full run worse than 14th place Minnesota going into Sunday. This is the worst starting rotation statistically the Orioles have ever had. I've gone back and looked.
Dude, I'm getting old. I'm 48, and I remember some bad teams. Yeah. I mean, I remember marching the Oswaldo Perazzas out there, and the Jay Tibbs, and the Ken Dixons. I remember all of that, and certainly, people your age are very familiar with the darkest period in the history of the organization, 50s notwithstanding, was the decade of angst, and from 1997 until 2011, 2012. This was a real mess around here for a decade and a half, and I think many, many people are familiar with this, what this looks like and what this is, and then in the middle of a baseball game on Sunday where they're getting their ass kicked again, where, Ubaldo Jimenez is taking the ball again. Ken Rosenthal, 25 years later, after covering the Orioles from the beginning, and once being admonished by Peter Angelos with a fax. I'll read that quote for you later if you like. It's very Angelosian as part of the Peter principles. But moronic caterwaulings of an insolent twit, I believe, was what Angelos called Ken Rosenthal. Rosenthal on Sunday reports that, well, the relievers are on the market, but Machado's not on the market, according to Duquette.
Yeah, and I mean, look. We'll see if that's, 2 weeks ago they were talking about still being buyers. So, and as I've said to you, we'll talk so much about the big picture. I mean, I'm still so much more intrigued with, concerned, whatever you want to call it, not good, as far as, okay, if you enter a rebuilding period, which it looks like they're trending strongly in that direction at this point, or at least they should be, is Dan Duquette the guy you want to do that? Do you want to be starting a rebuild with someone who, until otherwise stated, is a lame duck GM whose contract expires next year? I mean, there's just so many layers to this, but this weekend, I think it became very clear what I think most people had basically resigned themselves to the fact anyway. I mean, the starting pitching, you can talk about 1988, you can talk about 1998, 2003, go through the list, 98 through 2011. There were some god-awful teams in that period, but there was never a starting rotation that was as poor as this one. This is a historically poor starting rotation, and we can talk about all the different reasons why. I mean, you can talk about the players themselves who have to take accountability, certainly. You can talk about coaching and Roger McDowell and Dave Wallace and Dom Chidi leaving. You can talk about Dan Duquette. You can talk about Peter Angelos. I mean, everyone's got to wear it. You don't get to this point without saying, well, this guy doesn't have any blame. It's a matter of trying to figure out, okay, what piece of the pie does each person or each entity get? But here we are. This team's 7 games below 500. Ken Rosenthal reports on Sunday that they are going to be looking to shopping players. Manny Machado apparently not part of that list, although to me, I mean, it doesn't mean you have to trade him, but to me, you're nuts if you don't at least listen. If you're not keen on dealing him right now and you'd rather wait to the offseason, that's great, but at least listen in the meantime. But this is the Orioles, and we've talked about this at length over the last 5 or 6 years, where they do deserve credit for what they were able to accomplish over the previous 5 years. Even if it didn't get to the promised land, they did good things, but we talked about that throughout, that there was still plenty that was unorthodox, weird, messed up, however you want to characterize it, dysfunctional. We've talked about that a lot, and you are more apt to be able to overlook that when you're winning. When you're not winning, you start to analyze things, as you should, and then you see how this plays out. And, the big key in what Angelos reported was, yes, those players are available pending ownership approval, and that's obviously...
I wrote a whole book on it, Luke. Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not. Yeah. We'll be presenting the Peter Principles next week in the advance of the trading deadline. And look, man, when there's no plan and you start to hear the reports that they refuse to deal with the Nationals because of the Masson money, and, if Darren O'Day or Brad Brock or Zach Britton were to go down there and they were to win a champion, they were to be the Aroldis Chapman of this year and win a championship for the dreaded Nationals, how could we ever live with ourselves if we steal some other players, Adam Jones or Chris Tillman, which is the whole goal, last I checked, was to steal their best prospects so that you can win in 2020 or 21. We know they're not going to deal with the Yankees or the Red Sox for a similar reason. We know the old man's involved in this. That's clear to everyone, and that's been widely reported that he's involved in this, and we know we'll never hear from him, and we know whatever the truth is, it'll probably be shrouded until such point that Duquette and Showalter don't work here anymore, and they want to come back and bitch about it 2 or 3 years later, like Leo Mazzoni and Sam Perlazzo and everybody else who ever left here did in the aftermath of it all. But the Nationals are making deals. The Cubs threw Quintana on the hill on Sunday. They're a 500 team that went out into the market a year when they didn't have to win. The Cubs didn't have to go all in this year because they won last year, yet deals are being made right now, and needs are coming off the board. The Nationals are now one more team you can't use for leverage in any trade for a relief pitcher because they got 2 of them from Oakland on Sunday. So, just the way this team transacts business on a time schedule when they're under constraints, this is going to become a very, very bright light on them over the next 2 weeks by a fan base that was asleep for a little while, reinvigorated, but now the fans are paying attention at least, and there's going to be opportunity for truths to be reported, and there's going to be an end to this thing at the end of the trading deadline. And the Brocks and the Brittons and the O'Days and the Givens and the Machados and anyone else is either still going to be in an Oriole uniform or they're not going to be in an Oriole uniform. And there's going to be a bunch of prospects or there won't be. But I know this. There will be no pitching around here. There will still be dangling contracts at the end of next year, including, to your point, strategy and who is making these trades. I mean, I remember all the Jacobo Sequoias and the Chris Richards that we netted in the last sell-off at the end of July, which was, 2 decades ago now. And that's chronicled the Peter Principles Chapter 10 that's coming next week. And, I shake my head about all this because it really does feel like a black rabbit hole they're about to go into here, because it doesn't feel like there's a strategy or direction that any of us in the media, or even me in the non-media, or you in the real media, or anybody in the fake media or the fake news or whatever, that can look at this and say, what's the long play here? What's this team going to look like in 2019? Because I see what it is in 17, and it stinks, and I see where the farm system is and where their money is spent for next year. And I have a hard time believing that they're going to find 2 starters or 3 starters that are going to make a significant difference between now and next April. And I don't have a whole lot of confidence in the people making decisions here for a lot of reasons, but the obvious is you got a lame duck general manager out leading these trades over the next 2 weeks. That ain't ever good, man.
Well, and that's where you got to make a decision. And it's very clear. And let's strip away Orioles and what we know about ownership and the history of the organization for just a moment.
There's a playbook out there that how this is done and in the industry, by the way.
It starts very simply with this. First of all, you make the decision, okay, are you rebuilding, reloading, however you want to characterize it. And we've talked about that.
Self-evaluation, honest self-evaluation.
There are different degrees to which you can go. You can be as extreme as possible, or it can be somewhere in the middle, or you can stand pat, or you can buy. I mean, those are the options. Clearly, I think at this point, even the biggest Orioles optimists, they're not buying. So now you go through. But if you're ownership, you have to identify, okay, is our current general manager, is he the guy we want to be orchestrating a rebuild? And, a rebuilding is not something that just happens that you trade at the deadline and then you go into the offseason and say, okay, we're trying to win now. A rebuild is something that takes years. It's a process. It's something that has to be done it's not something that you should do with haste. It's not something that you just kind of rush into it. So you ask the question, is our current GM the guy we want long term? If he is, you need to extend him or pursue an extension. If he is, but he doesn't want an extension, then you need to move on. If he's not the guy, why wait until the end of next year, and why would you want a lame duck GM starting the rebuilding process? So to me, if there's one argument for not selling at the trade deadline, meaning in the next 2 weeks, it's if you've decided that, or if Dan Duquette has made it clear that he has no interest in signing an extension, or you have no interest in keeping him, then is it wise to have him being the one to sell off parts? Or do you make a change at the end of the season? Whoever the new GM is, give them the pieces to try to make deals and identify prospects. Because the thing is, getting back to your point as far as some of the moves that have been made already, there's still a market for these guys. You don't have to complete trades in mid-July. Frankly, you don't have to complete any trades at the end of July, because we're not talking about guys who have expiring contracts other than guys who really aren't going to give them any kind of a return. But my point is, you need to identify what's the vision and who's going to be executing that vision. And if it's Dan Duquette, then you need to commit to him. If it's not Dan Duquette, then you need to look at the next step in hiring the next person or whoever it is. And it doesn't make sense to hold on to Dan Duquette for another year. Reassign him, let him go, whatever you want to do.
Dan Duquette's got to be one of the most unhappy men on earth right now. You know what I mean? Like, all of my sources tell me he can't wait to leave. Now, whether that's true or not, time will tell.
Sure.
But in a normal organization, Luke, I mean, let's strip the goof that owns this team and his goofy kids and all the history out of this. If this were textbook baseball, Buck Showalter would be in jeopardy of his job right now. Dan Duquette would be in jeopardy of his job because they're at the end of this rainbow. They're at the end of a deal next year. They're going nowhere this year. And if you're ready to retool and reload and move, you fire them, you pay them what you owe them for next year, and you move on with a clean sweep. Angelos will never fire either one of them. He will get them to resign and give up their money the way he did with Davey Johnson, or not. And in the case of Duquette, he already forbid him from leaving once. Who knows what Showalter thinks about all this? Because I think, he's the great fraud poker player in that he will tell you whatever you want to hear. Like, so, you'll never see his poker hand, never, in the case of Buck. But the organization has a long, tried-and-true history with how they handle these things. And when you're hearing the leaks that Angelos will be, approving all deals and Machado won't be involved, and I mean, where this is coming from inside the industry because there are no secrets when all this comes, when all's said and done. And Peter's still running this place, and that's just a fact. And if Baltimore doesn't wake up on a Monday morning and realize that he's still really running this thing, even though he never speaks, he's never seen, he's never heard from, except like right around now. In any other organization, Buck Showalter would be having trouble holding on to his job right now after the Jimenez thing last year and how bad the team looks right now. I mean, they look lackluster. They don't look like a Buck team. They look like they're jaking it. They look overmatched. They look disinterested. They look a little embarrassed and looking for, like, shelter at this point. They're having bad at-bats. The bullpen didn't even look so great on Sunday, and these guys they want to trade, they better come out of the bullpen and throw some darts if they want to wind up in the pennant race this year and wind up in a good situation, because I don't know what the market is for Darren O'Day with his contract right now.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. Good organizations don't fire a Buck Showalter quality manager for having 4 terrible months of baseball. I mean,
fair enough, but he would be under review.
Oh, sure. And look, and I've made it very clear. I was, going back and forth with some people on Twitter about this during Sunday's game because, well, it was a 6-0 game at the time, and I wasn't all that interested in what was going on the field. But that's not to say that he doesn't have to wear it. Everyone has to wear this. But a lot of what you said, and look, have there been times where there have been lapses and you wonder about focus, and certainly the at-bats on Saturday and Sunday compared to what they did Friday where they came back from an 8-0 deficit? Absolutely. But again, this is where I have to stress, and it's not to excuse anyone. It's the pitchers, it's the coaching, it's the front office, ownership, everyone. Scouting, player development, going back to the minor leagues because they have no one at AAA that is a palatable alternative, really, to any of these guys. They continue to run out there every 5 days. They all have to wear it, but we're dealing with a historically terrible starting rotation. This starting rotation is 1.3 runs worse in ERA from what last year's was. And what did we talk about last year? The starting rotation wasn't good. They're 1.3 runs worse in starter ERA this year compared to last year. Now, look, in a perfect world, they're professionals. They block everything out. These guys are human beings. And when you're position players on this team and you do what they did on Friday night, for example, where they figured out a way to come back to tie up the game after they were down 8-0, but then Wade Miley goes out and gets bombed the next day. Ubaldo Jimenez gets bombed the next day. I don't care how strong your resolve is. At some point, your will just kind of collapses. It just does. And look, that's not an excuse. Clearly, the offense has underperformed. Clearly, the bullpen hasn't been what it's been in recent years. A lot of that happened to do with injury. Some of that happened to do with guys being overworked, and some of it, guys just not being quite as good as they'd been in previous years. But so much of this, to me, still comes back to where the pitching is just so horrendous that, I just don't know what you expect. It's almost like when Joe Flacco tore his ACL and you have Ryan Mallett as your quarterback. It's like, well, what do you expect? When your starting pitching is that bad.
I expect Ryan Mallett to go out and beat the Pittsburgh Steelers Christmas week, and he did. So there
maybe I made a bad argument there, but when you're talking about one aspect being so incredibly poor, there is going to be a trickle-down effect. And that's not to absolve guys. It was listless on Sunday. It was listless on Saturday. I gave the lineup a lot of credit on Friday night for the way they fought back.
Managers get blamed for listless, usually in baseball.
They do. But at the same time, as I said, Buck Showalter's not the one throwing pitches. It's at some point, and look.
I'm not trying to fire Buck, just so you know. No, I'm trying to say that, he's been given the golden goose here, and when it goes bad, and they look shaky to me, boy, I don't, I know Buck's going to say this and say that, but Buck's also got to be wondering, like, well, I'm out of here in 15 months, and can we really win next year? And wouldn't I be better served to just keep my mouth shut, roll through here, and, whenever the time comes, I can go manage somewhere else where they have better players? Because one of the things that did draw Buck here in the beginning was Buck really did see talent in this organization. He did.
And there was talent.
And there was. And there isn't anymore.
What was the work of Andy McPhail. And guys just, young guys needed a little more time to find their footing. It's, for every player like Aaron Judge who comes in and does unbelievable things, there are lots of guys that take 2 or 3 years. Chris Tillman was a great example. He looked terrible his first 3 years with the Orioles and then kind of figured things out in 2012 and had a nice run. But so I guess what I'm saying as far as all those other effects that we're seeing, I'm not saying that those things are okay, but you're talking about a pitcher who's given up, Kevin Gausman, 8 runs in 3 innings. Yeah, everything that happens after that a lot of times is going to look like you're going through the motions because, what do you do? I mean, it's just, it's really hard to do what these guys do, and when you have one aspect of the game that's not even competitive, a 5 ERA would at least give you a chance, most nights, but when you're talking about guys that are giving up more runs than innings they've even pitched, as we saw over the weekend, it's just incredible to see. So I'm not excusing Buck Showalter, and I think there are 10 other things to address in this organization that are much more pressing issues than the manager.
Well, the number one is who's going to make these decisions. Who's calling the shots on trades, on deals, on the system, and that's where, quite frankly, they're a mess right now.
And that's where I come back to. Like, I have such a look. We're going to talk so much about Zach Britton. I mean, we've already talked about Zach Britton and Manny Machado and Darren O'Day and Adam Jones and anyone that we've talked about that would potentially be a trade target or a non-trade target. But until there's some clarity, whether it's known or it's just kept too close to the vest within the organization, it almost feels like a moot point because, again, do you really want to be starting a rebuild with a guy that's not committed long-term, whether it's his choice or the organization's choice? I mean, it starts with that. And then once you have a GM in place, whether it's hypothetically extending Dan Duquette or bringing in someone new or hiring someone internal, whatever the outcome is, then you talk about Buck Showalter, and then you talk about the coaching staff. And, as much as you and I have talked about this at times, what about player development? What about the international market that they continue to just completely ignore? I mean, these are all big issues, especially when you've come to the end of your window with your current group of players. And, you can talk all you want about dealing Zach Britton or maybe trading Manny Machado, whether they do that or not, regardless of what they're saying right now. But at the same time, you're not going to get 100 prospects to come back on those 2 or 3 guys they trade. At some point, you got to do a better job developing players. And I know a lot of people just talk about spending money. Look, their payroll has come into the top 10 in Major League Baseball.
But they also were famous for spending money unwisely 15
and
years
that's
ago.
my
Period.
Point. I mean, at some point, I understand the trepidation with not wanting to give a 17-year-old shortstop from the Dominican $3 million, but at the same time, when you're not particularly great drafting players and you're not a team that's going to go spend $220 million like the Dodgers and the Yankees having that great of a payroll, and you're just going to completely ignore the international market, you're just giving yourself a really small margin for error there in terms of finding good young baseball talent. So, these are so many of the issues that have been there all along. Even over the last 5 years, it's just when you're winning, it's not magnified as much. When the Ravens are winning games, we're not necessarily talking about their deficiencies as much as when they're losing. The same has been true of the Orioles over the last 5 years. There's still plenty of weird, messed up things about the organization that didn't change, but the results in the field changed. Now, as it reverts to what we saw pre-2012, that's when you ask the questions. But again, if you're going to sell, great, but I just don't know how you can expect Dan Duquette to proceed if he's not the long-term guy. Like I said, either by their choice or by his choice. So until you have a resolution there, I'm really uneasy about that. And that's not to say that he would just recklessly make a terrible trade and try to sabotage the organization. I'm not questioning his integrity from that standpoint, but if you're uneasy about how things look, and we've talked about the farm system, we've talked about some of the talent that he's traded away. We've talked about the Gerardo Parra deals and the Bud Norris deal and Eduardo Rodriguez for Andrew Mel. We've talked about all those at length, and we'll continue to talk about those as we see some of those pitchers elsewhere doing things that, frankly, could help the Orioles in the present. But the long story short, Dan Duquette, he's got to be accountable. The scouting department, everyone has to be accountable for what the farm system looks like, and how much of that is ownership as far as philosophy with the international market. Yeah, I'll buy that completely. But they haven't drafted particularly well, and some of their first-round picks, a DJ Stewart, for example, they haven't really provided the kind of return here over the last couple of years that makes you think they're going to be major difference makers. So they have a couple pieces here and there in their system, but they need to replenish it, and you have an opportunity to do this now. If they pull this off correctly, just talking about the pieces that they have right now and deal, it doesn't mean they're going to be good next year. Doesn't mean they're going to be good the year after that. But there are attractive enough pieces here that they could move that if they did this correctly, by 2020, they could be back in a position where they're...
That's a long time from now, by the way.
Well,
it is. It's a lot of baseball games for you to sit out there and watch them suck.
Okay, but
I hear where you are, but I mean, that's...
Rebuild. You can't rebuild in a year. I mean, that's where they are right now. But my point is, there's a way to do this where you can, 2 years from now, be back in a competitive standpoint. Or you can do it poorly, and you can be just as terrible 4 years from now, and then realize you kind of have to continue, or you have to start over again, as the Orioles did about 6 different times over the course of that 14-year period. So, but my point is, they have an opportunity here to get some players back, some young talent back that can really help them come 2019 and kind of be in that position where things aren't looking so dire in the mid and long term. Short term, there's going to be pain regardless. I mean, that ship sailed, and
the Rangers are here, and here come the Astros this week.
Well, I mean, the Rangers aren't anything to write home about this year either. But
they're going to see Hamels though.
Yeah, but it's going to be it's been ugly. So you can either continue to go down this road with these players and try to make another run next year, which I still, if you ask me my prediction right now, I still think they're going to end up trying to make another run next year, but they're not going to do the things necessary to really give themselves any reasonable chance of doing it. But that's my prediction for right now. But short term, it is what it is at this point. It's not in the cards for 2017. So do you start to make some decisions, start to lay down a roadmap for getting yourselves back in position come 2019, come 2020, and they have so much. There are some teams out there that are really bad and don't have anything they want to trade. How many years did the Orioles kind of be in that no man's land where, all right, yeah, they could be sellers, but they didn't have any pieces that anyone wanted. I mean,
Jeff Conine, right. Exactly.
They had. You could name the number of attractive pieces that they had to sell, probably on one hand from about 2001.
Eric Bedard. Yeah,
I'll give
you the first three.
Brian Roberts, before they decided to extend him to that deal that was horrendous, with him not being able to stay on the field. So, so they do have a few pieces here that they can move, whether it's now, whether it's the end of the season in the off season where, that's still an option. But whether they do that, whether they get ownership approval, whether they trade for the right pieces, and I think that's certainly a fair question when you look at Dan Duquette's track record with some of the trades he has made. There have been a couple good diamonds in the rough that he's acquired, but there have been some other moves where didn't work out so well for him. So it still comes back to, for me, until you figure out exactly who's going to be leading the charge in this process, and it's not an easy process. I think it's really uneasy. I'm uneasy with the idea of you're going to say, okay, even if you would tell Dan Duquette, all right, listen to offers of Machado, I don't know if I want Dan Duquette being the one to trade Manny Machado if you feel...
And I certainly don't want Peter Angelos to say, did we get Chris Widger in that deal?
Sure, yeah. But my point is, if you're going to trade Manny Machado, I'd kind of like the guy that's going to be the GM for the long haul to be the one to do that. And that's my whole point of you either extend Dan Duquette or you start talking about an exit strategy and bringing someone new in.
Bring in Brady Angelos and let him run the place.
And that's absolutely, there's always that.
I laugh about that this week. Hey, dude, a week and a half from now, you'll be the one at the press conference.
Yeah.
Not being allowed to ask questions.
Go
ahead.
Again, stripping away the Orioles part of it and history and what we know, those are that decision has to be made before you proceed. I don't like the idea of any organization having a potential lame duck GM starting a rebuilding process. That makes no sense to me whatsoever.
We do things differently around here, Luke.
True.
I don't know if you've noticed or not, but we've had a lot of success around here the last few years. I mean, and that's really where it is. I mean, they have had some success the last few years, and now, you know, something's got to give here, and I plan on shining a bright light on whatever decisions are made, because I am of the mindset, as you and I sit here and speak about this with the Texas Rangers coming to town, that there is no real strategy. You know what I mean? I don't know that there's been any brain trust all getting together and saying, we are absolutely doing this. I can see where Duquette says, well, I've been on the phone working on deals, and of course I have to call PETA and check in with it. You know, I mean, you can't do baseball that way. You know, when it comes time to pull the trigger, you can't go back to the old man and say, well, the Nationals are going to give me, Manny, Mo, and Jack for O'Day and Britton, and have the owner. Well, we don't do business with them. What? Well, that doesn't make any sense to me, man.
I hear you. The one thing I'll say, I think for ownership to be involved on a buy or sell, when you make that decision, I think most ownership groups, from the very beginning, when you say, okay, we're blowing up the team, I think most ownership groups are at least in the know at that point. But yes, all the little ancillary details, negotiations and making a potential trade, that's where you start to talk about how this organization historically has just moved so slowly with those types of things, where you do worry about missing out on the possibility of the best offer or the right offer, or dealing with certain teams or not dealing with certain teams. I'm not surprised about the Nationals thing, and quite frankly, I'm not sure how much willingness there'd be on their side to work out something with the Orioles either. But the whole idea that you won't trade within the division, I mean that's crazy to me. I mean, the Orioles 3 years ago, they dealt Eduardo Rodriguez to the Red Sox, and the Red Sox dealt Andrew Miller here, and it worked out really well for both sides. The Red Sox got the long-term benefit. The Orioles may not have won that Detroit series without Andrew Miller. Who knows? But it shows it can be done. But this artificial restricting yourself, and that's not to say those have to be the first teams that you try to make a deal with. I mean, no one's arguing that at all. I think most teams in baseball or any sport would probably, if they had their way, avoid dealing within the division. But if that's the best deal, that's the best deal. But as far as the Nationals thing, I'm not surprised to hear that. It is what it is. I mean, we've talked so long about that, and we'll continue to talk about that. But at this point,
at least until football starts, then we'll stop. Maybe.
Sure. But at this point, I mean, to me, and even despite what Rosenthal's report said about Machado, you should be listening to everything. Does that mean you have to deal everyone in the next 2 weeks? No. If you don't get a deal that you feel is appropriate and right for that commodity, then you can wait till the off season. But to me, I don't think you can wait much longer than that. I mean, if we're talking a year from now, if they're going to trade Manny Machado because they're 10 games below 500, yeah, they'll get something for him, but it's not going to be nearly what they would get now or what they would get this off season. And hey, for that matter, we were talking about this last off season about the possibility of at least listening what you could get for someone like Zach Britton. So there's still time there. It doesn't have to be now, but the longer and longer you wait, the more diminished that return ends up being.
He is Luke Jones. We are WNST.net. Luke will be at the ballpark all week suffering whatever fate is at. I hope it's not 30-3. That's sort of the famous Texas Rangers score. And, of course, the Astros in this week. Luke will also be preparing for all things purple, as will our Brian Billick, who's going to be calling preseason games at WBAL and on the Ravens television network as well. So we're going to be hearing from Evan Washburn later on in the week on that, and I'll chase down Brian once the season gets going in 2 weeks. I'll leave him alone. You can find either one of us out in the Bayou Toyota Audio Vault, and of course Luke's work is out at WNST.net. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, and streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. Headed to London with the Ravens, headed to London for some scouting later on this week, and we will have the Peter Principles in its entirety next week here at WNST.net. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.